Hello, my name is Raymond Cuttill. In this talk, I'm going to talk about from Amoeba to Feminist, why we are where we are from an evolutionary perspective. Now, I say this partly in jest, but I do believe that in a sense, there's a connection between the origins of life and the way we find ourselves and where the feminists are. I believe that the men's rights movement and the position we find ourselves in today is not an accident, and we can make little headway against the feminist narrative when we are apparently presenting fair and reasonable arguments. As a student of psychology, with a particular emphasis on comparative psychology, comparing us to other species, and evolutionary psychology, looking at the human race's evolution, I believe these disciplines have something to give us. I'm going to talk about how we go from a single-cell creature through multicellular and how this leads to the sexual reproduction, and that leads to male and female differences other than just sexual. In particular, we have males from many species who are protective or hunters and providers and competitive with other males. Many species also have packs or groups and hierarchies within those. And in the human situation, we end up talking about rights and outcomes and end up with the following modern feminist narrative. I hope to show that all these are connected. I have to point out that these ideas are vehemently opposed by those who subscribe to the blank slate ideology, the social constructionists. This is challenged in Steven Pinker's book, The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature. Now you may suggest, or the social constructionists do, that a newborn baby is nothing but an empty vessel in which you can put all behavior, including sexual behavior, and it has nothing to do with the parents, let alone the ancestors, and let alone other species. However, I will point out, take but one example, if you compare a baby to a baby chimp to a puppy, they all will act negatively to a loud noise, and I do not think that that is a coincidence. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. It takes about 1 billion years before we see the fossilized remains of microorganisms. We start to see structure. We see the single cell. Bacteria and viruses and other microorganisms follow this plan. To reproduce, they have to have either DNA or RNA or both. 2 billion years ago, we start to see the cells organize this DNA and RNA into a central nucleus where it's better protected. The cell with the nucleus is known as a eukaryote. Not all microorganisms are eukaryotes. Bacteria are not, but quite a lot are. Amoeba are. Now it turns out that this is the best blueprint for all complex life. All plants, animals, insects, fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals, including us, are eukaryotes. Now to reproduce, the eukaryote increases in size, but then it has to duplicate or copy the nucleus. It ends up being a cell with 2 nucleus in it. It splits apart and you have 2 identical cells, each with a nucleus, each capable of carrying on life. And this is the way the amoeba reproduces, And the way the amoeba reproduces is the same basic mechanism if you not only want to create a new amoeba, but also a new kitten or a new baby. Single cells can only go so far. There are advantages such as food gathering when several cells work together. Initially, it's just a colony of identical cells. Each can continue on their own if they wish, but then some of them start specializing. Different cells do different jobs. No longer does a single cell do everything. You now have the beginnings of a multicellular organism. All complex life is a multicellular organism. The earliest examples of this are fungi, about 1.5 billion years ago. Plants and animals turn up about 3/4 of a billion years ago. But once you have specialization, you can't simply clone each cell individually. You have to create a whole new creature. You now need a proper method of reproduction. Asexual reproduction, that is reproduction without any kind of sex, is quite a common method. By this token, the amoeba is clearly asexual. For large animals, one way is to lay an egg which contains your own genes, and this hatches to be an identical copy, a clone of you. No sex is involved. Some insects, even some hammerhead sharks, and the Komodo dragon use this method. And the idea is much loved by feminists. They dream of having women being able to clone themselves without any man being involved. Sorry to disappoint them, asexual is not something you choose. Now, there are advantages to asexual reproduction. If there's plenty of food around, you can lay lots of eggs and rapidly increase your numbers. The disadvantages are the lack of genetic variety. Anything that affects you affects all your clones, disease or some other problem. If you're not improving, you're losing ground. Sexual reproduction is first seen over 1 billion years ago. The idea is to exchange genes with those of your species who may be stronger or faster, and you pass these genes on to your young. A few, however, hedge their bets and have both asexual and sexual reproduction. The aphid does this, but at different times in its life cycle. This, however, is not common. Now, once you have male and female in your species, one possibility is to be a hermaphrodite and have both male and female parts. The earthworms do this. However, there doesn't seem to be a lot of advantage in all being identical. It's much easier to have separate males and females, and that is what most species do. Once you have separate males and females, you have to be choosy about who you mate with. This is sexual selection. Darwin pointed out that sexual selection is part of evolution. Natural selection has to occur first. You have to survive before you can procreate. But having survived, you may now wish to choose your best sexual partner to get the best next generation. The male normally contributes only sperm, whereas the female produces a complicated egg. In the human case, the father can contribute millions of sperm, but the mother is nurturing and creating a baby that, when born, has 2 trillion cells. Hence, the female makes demands on the male to ensure he's the best father of her young. This can include mating calls, mating dances, providing food or gifts, or being impressive by size or colour or in other ways. This leads feminists to suggest you need only a few men to provide sperm for all women. In some sense, this is true, but I'm reminded of a apocryphal tale about the artist Picasso. Picasso's in a restaurant when someone asks for his autograph. He gives it and says, "That'll be $10,000. $10,000, they say, but it only took you a few seconds. No, says Picasso, it took me a lifetime. In other words, to be the right male for her, you can't just turn up and be male. You have to be bigger or stronger or cleverer than other males, because if you're not, genetically speaking, you are history. Once you have males and females, you get sexual dimorphism. That is where males and females differ in ways other than their sex. Peacocks are a well-known example of this. The peahen blends perfectly in with her environment, camouflage. The peacock has a magnificent display, visible to everyone, including predators. If he does not, he doesn't reproduce. Other obvious differences include size, but more of that later. But there are plenty of species where the male is different from the female, such as birds having different colors. However, one thing disputed by social constructionists is there are differences in personality or temperament between male and female. Now, according to the Big Five personality traits, women are higher in neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. Men are higher in openness to experience. Women higher in neuroticism may sound like a flaw, but a concern can be useful. Imagine this scenario. There's a couple with a baby and they're threatened by a predator such as a lion. Should they attack the lion? All three might die. All three run away. The same. What if the woman attacks the lion and the man runs away with the baby? Well, being without a father is detrimental, but can be survivable. Being without a mother is often fatal. So it seems to make so sense that the male attacks or defends against the lion, whilst the mother runs away and protects her young. Her concern, her neuroticism, makes her do this or encourages her to. Darwin said that sexual dimorphism was to do with sexual selection. And he also thought this also makes males develop characteristics useful for fighting in order to impress females. One way males deal with this is by having male-to-male competition. It's possible, for example, to even kill the other males. Some try to do this. However, this is a very dangerous option. You not only can get killed, but even if you're successful, you can get seriously injured. The alternative is a jousting or strength demonstration. If you can convince the other male that he would come off worse in a fight, he will take the judicious course of leaving and letting you have your way. Although the female is desirable, dying is not. The stakes are high. These competitions may go on all day. Most females reproduce, but males often don't, even in their entire lifetime. One way they compete is to travel where she is. They travel from their own territory through other territories and to her, whereas she stays safely in her own territory. Males respond quite quickly to a signal from a female that she's ready. This can be illustrated by the insects like the praying mantis and the black widow spider. The females often eat the males, an idea much loved by feminists. The praying mantis, for example, attracts males with her pheromones, and when they respond, she may have sex, or she may eat them, or both. It would seem to make more sense for the male to escape and procreate again. But there's a possibility, perhaps, that if the male leaves, the female might die and then lay no eggs. Hence, the male sacrifice may well be something that benefits the species. Males often sacrifice themselves or risk danger. This is quite common and is necessary to impress females, and it seems to benefit the species. One thing that a lot of species have is sexual size dimorphism, the difference in size by which sex you are. In some species, the females are larger than the males. There's certain fish and spiders and reptiles that do that. Birds of prey, like the eagles, do it. The female is noticeably larger than the male. It seems if there's no particular reason for the male to be larger, he quite often is smaller. However, in mammals in particular, we see a number of cases where the male is larger than the female. Being a larger creature comes at a cost. He has to hunt and graze more. If he's 10% larger, he has to eat 10% more. If he cannot eat 10% more, he may starve and die. In a sense, he's a vanguard for the species. If he succeeds and survives until mating season, the next generation could be 10% larger. If he does not, then someone else fathers the next generation and it's the usual size. The fact that men are willing to sacrifice themselves is another idea that feminists like. The idea that males are expendable. I would suggest that males are not expendable the way a car radio is in a car. You can still drive it. It's more like a wheel on an 18-wheeler. You can lose one tire, but you cannot lose all of them. There's another thing about larger males. They're stronger than the females. Hence, males could in theory rape them. Attempts to find this behavior amongst animals, however, net only a few examples. It does exist, but it is rare. Given the reports that say it's common amongst the human race, I suggest it is not. We make a comparison between rape and consensual sex. In the UK, as many as 10,000 allegations are made per year. Let's be generous and assume a lot are unreported and call it 100,000. Now, if the UK population is around 70 million, it's about 1% of the world. So multiplied by 100, you get 10 million rapes per year worldwide. This is 10 million too many. Leaving aside consideration of rapes other than male on female, such as male on male, female on male, and female on female, let's look how commonplace this is compared with consensual sex. In a population of over 7 billion, I suggest there's about 3 billion couples. Allegedly, the average for couples is to have sex twice a week. This means 6 billion times a week around the planet, approximately 300 billion times a year. If you compare that to the 10 million rapes, you find that for every 30,000 consensual sex acts, there is one rape. so that is fairly rare. So why aren't more men raping women? If, as the feminist suggests, it's a male inclination. The lack of numbers suggests it's not a viable way for a surviving species. There are species where the male actually does whatever the female wants, has advantages. Taking female choice away is bad for the species. Darwin's sexual selection tells us that females have choice and always have, and have used it throughout evolution, history, and continue to use it to the day. To suggest otherwise not only disempowers all women, but all females of all species. Now, as species get larger, they tend to form groups or packs, or in the case of humans, tribes. Now, often the male appears dominant in these tribes or packs, and in a sense, that's not the whole story. Lions, for example, there are plenty of documentaries about the lion's pride. The lion's pride consists normally of a core of females, sisters, cousins, and several generations of them all together. There are a few males, and then there are cubs. Now, the males appear to be strongest, and this doesn't seem very fair, but they have to be the strongest that are available. If new males come up and challenge them, if they're successful, the previous ones leave. They may be getting older, and they have to go and fend for themselves, perhaps together, but certainly in small numbers. The same is actually true of the cubs. Once they start growing up to become adults, the females, of course, stay, but the males are expelled. There doesn't seem to be any documentary about what the males do on their own, but clearly they leave the pride, have to hunt single or in small numbers, and survive on their own until they can successfully take over another pride. So concentrating on the lion's pride just tells basically half of the story. It's a similar kind of thing with the gorilla troop, for example. You have a single male, large and aggressive, and it seems unfair. He has an entire harem to himself. And you might also ask why there's only one. Well, basically only one is what they need. Jungle threats tend to be single predators. It's difficult to hunt in groups in a jungle, but the male must repel them. If he fails, they leave. If he grows old, they leave. He has to be seen to do this. That's why males seem very enthusiastic about patrolling the area. They want to do it, and they want to be seen to do it, because in some ways his position is precarious. As long as he's the best available male, he will retain his position. As soon as he's not, he's gone. In other words, for the lions and the gorillas and lots of other species, the male is there, but only as long as it suits the females. Once you live in a group, you need a hierarchy. I have to, of course, at this point mention the lobsters made famous by Jordan Peterson, which show that we have similar hormones and they allow us to live in the hierarchy. Now, one of the things, if you're in a group, is you get to eat, but you have to share. And the question is, how much do you get? And that's where the hierarchy comes in. Now, if you can do it on your own, such as the tiger, you get the entire kill, you keep it all to yourself. But if you can't, such as the lions, difficulty hunting them on the plains, you have to form a pride, and then immediately you get a hierarchy. What you want to do, if possible, is get the maximum share in the hierarchy. The only way to do that is to challenge one of the others, not fight if possible, because it weakens the whole group. But once you can do that, you can move up and down the hierarchy. Now, they're not set in stone. I mean, there's one example I've seen, particularly with the chimpanzee troop, and there was a young male It was seen by some as a rising star, a possible next alpha, or soon when he grew up. A female wanted to curry favour and by having sex with him. Now the alpha male, along with some wingmen in the group, tried to stop all females having sex with anyone else. So she determinedly decided to get round that. A couple of her friends, female friends, staged a fight, and the males tried to stop that. Meanwhile, while they're distracted, she has sex with this next possible alpha. So now she has a relationship with him, and should he become the alpha, she's higher up in the hierarchy. Hierarchies essentially allow us all, in one way or another, to get along in peace. Groups are a good place to bring young up in. The one thing you have to have in the group, of course, is maternal investment. Now, some creatures we know don't do that at all. Fish, for example, lay millions of eggs and have no concern about what happens to them. By sheer numbers, they hope, having laid the millions of eggs, that some survive. Reptiles are a little more mixed. For example, turtles lay eggs, but the eggs are on their own and have to make their own way. Whereas, for example, crocodiles, the mothers there will happily have the young in their mouths without harming them in any way, just to help them get off a good start in life. Birds, we know, sit on eggs and then nurture the hatchling as they come out. But this is especially true for mammals, since it's biologically required. The young have to have the milk of the mother, or they will not survive, and they tend to be then taught by the mother how to behave, where food and water is, and so forth. So it seems the more complex creature you are, the less young you're likely to have, and then you absolutely need maternal investment to ensure there's a next generation. And once you have maternal investment, quite often you need paternal investment. Not always, but sometimes. I will mention one notable example, much loved by the social constructionists, that is the seahorse. The seahorse has a pouch which acts as a nurture in the male, where the eggs can be deposited, which then grow into the young seahorses, and the male looks after them. This is much love for the idea that somehow men can have babies, which the seahorses don't actually do anyway. In spite of the fact they may like it, 1 billion years of evolution won't let that change. But males looking after the young or being concerned about them is important, especially in packs. And females are well aware of the social interaction between the fathers and the young and tend to favour such males. Seems to be part of sexual selection there. For example, male chimps tend to be the first against any external threat, and it looks like that finds favour with the females. Even today, even though there's no tigers around, if there's some kind of threat, men are usually to the fore to face it, and women seem to like that. The alternative, that men are choosing hostility and war, is kind of like saying that perhaps at one point men were asked, do you want to risk death by hunting or protecting the tribe? And they turned around and said, oh yes, I want that. I'm quite happy to risk death. It seems that it's likely that it was needed to protect the tribe, and that is what men have done. I will add that fathers are good for babies and children. This is not and should not be a controversial statement. We know there are biological effects on a man when he becomes a father. I kind of like to liken the human race to a sort of a square and a circle. Men are the square and women are the circle, and it's kind of, which is within the square. It's kind of like the keeps of a castle. There's an inner keep and an outer keep. Children are in the circle. Women relate to other women. They have to maintain the circle. And their focus tends to be in towards the children. Men in the square face outwards and tend to focus outwards. Now the relationship between the square and the circle, the men and women, becomes when individual women fancy individual men. That's why we hear the insult is incel is quite common, because it's like women are human automatically, but men are only human if women fancy them. Hence the worst possible insult is that no woman fancies you. And I think this explains a lot, such as how feminists can apparently have male relatives and think they're okay, but somehow, without irony, then say all men are bad. Now I'd like to mention a word about men and emotions. Men are often said not to be emotional, to be logical. I think men are emotional in spite of all claims to the contrary. It defies all logic and evolution to say otherwise. You just have to see men at a football match, or perhaps when they're at their most vulnerable. Now they do appear logical compared with women, because they seem to be quite involved in being orderly or being planning. But nevertheless, everything they have for a purpose has an emotional underpinning. For example, if they go to work they don't like, it's just because they want to live. You cannot express goals like that without using a word like want or desire that underpins everything. So even if they're working in a calculated way, the goal is desirable. So why do we see this difference between men and women? We've seen men crying, for example. Occasionally I've seen footballers do it, and the worst critics of them are women. So seldom do they do it twice. That's a criticism they often level against the men's rights movement. We just crybabies. Doesn't matter what we're complaining about, how it seems valid to us, we're just dismissed as crybabies. So men have to be resolute, they have to be firm. You can see this, for example, with the Titanic. Feminists have a lot of trouble explaining the Titanic because many women got off it. Why not all the men if the patriarchy is working for men, but somehow the patriarchy is working against men on the Titanic? There's an example of how men and women are treated differently in how the children were treated. For example, if you're female, you must be a girl or a woman and you get off the Titanic. If you're male, you have to be a man or a boy. If you're a man, you don't get off the Titanic. 11-year-old William Carter was told that he was too old and he should get out of the lifeboat, at which point his mother threw her shawl around him and said, now she's a girl, and he got off the Titanic. But therein lies the example. Being a boy rather than a man is debatable. Whenever it suits some people, you're a man and you have to be resolute and drown on the Titanic. So I might suggest to you that men do have emotions. It's just to some extent they censor them because of women. Now I'm going to start talking about why we get where we are, what our present situation is. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed an upper limit to the amount of relationships we can keep in our mind. And remember, he proposed a number of around 150, although some put it higher, as much as 290. And anyway, the limit to how many relationships your brain can hold depends on the size of the brain. The larger the size of the brain, it seems, the larger the group of primates, and it correlates well with that. So as we go from being a tribe to a village to a city to a nation, we have to learn how to get along. And 8 billion is a considerable higher number than 150. We have to get along to have less war and less arguing. Once you get too big for chief or king, you start getting rights being spoken about. We end up with things like the United States Constitution. So that when the government seems fair, you get peace. If it's unfair, you get riots and violence. So equal rights gives us a fair society that we can all live in, hopefully in peace. Once we get equal rights, some people start talking about equal outcomes. Most famously Karl Marx, author of the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, 3 volumes about what he thinks should be fair and equal outcome for all. Critics at the time even say that he seems to hate the bourgeoisie much more than he loves the proletariat. In any case, he himself would probably be considered middle class. Nevertheless, talk like this went around the world, and it doesn't seem to be a coincidence that in 1848, the Communist Manifesto and the Declaration of Sentiments were published. We can see similarities between the two if we compare these 2 paragraphs. In the Communist Manifesto, the modern bourgeoisie was a society that is sprouted from the ruins of feudal society, has not done away with class antagonism. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, and new forms of struggle in place to replace the old ones. Whereas the Declaration of Sentiments says the history of mankind is a history of repeating injuries and absorption on the part of man towards women, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. I think you can see the similarities. I should note that 68 women and 32 men signed that, perhaps an early example of virtue signaling. Now, for the final part, feminism. How do we get from the amoeba to the feminist? Well, as I said, the basic cell structure of the eukaryote is the best of all for complex life. The cell with a nucleus with DNA in it. And once you get complex life, you get sexual reproduction. That's the best method. Dimorphism occurs, there's differences between males and females. Sexual selection occurs, that males compete with me, males or try and impress her or do various things for her. And also you get groups and hierarchies developing around them. Ultimately, you end up for people with cities and then countries and then rights. But then you have, that's extended to include equal outcomes, Marxism and feminism, all the derivatives and similar things stem from that. Males support females and always have, unless you believe nothing previous counts, nothing the men did before, nothing that any male in any species did before matters. Basically, you have to throw Darwin out for psychology, but you're okay to be evolutionary about the physiology of people. Originally, and still true, that the emotional bond holds the tribe together. She has to decide how her children are dealt with. He supports her, and it's a kind of matter of a life or death for him. He has to kind of date or die. From the praying mantis to the gorilla to men, he may die for her. If you're male now, you come from a long line of males who have pleased females. The Titanic is an example of suggesting all this is history and somehow it's changed or can be rewritten is ridiculous. We've had 1.5 billion years of sexual reproduction, sexual selection, and sexual size dimorphism, especially in mammals. So the bias has always been and continues to be towards females, in particular women. And when you question this, it's like dealing with a wayward child. They want to say or do anything to get their own way, regardless of how wrong or right it might be. This is epitomized if you look at gamma bias proposed by Dr. John Parry and Dr. Martin Seeger. It proposes that female achievement is lauded, whilst male villainy is vilified, but there's very little attention paid to female villainy or male achievements by comparison. This is demonstrably true, plus you get the Marxist interpretation, always looking for an alleged oppressor with no other's perspective being examined. When you challenge this narrative, it's like an emotional threat. You're trying to expel her from the tribe. She'll be eaten by the lions and die. Men always have and continue to please and compete for women. Women tend to get along with women as far as possible. The men's rights movement threatens her desire to be protected, like she would die if she concedes. Emotionally, she has a need to get her way in a deep, fundamental way. It's for her benefit, and that, in theory, benefits the species, and usually does. So the Amoeba to feminist link is we are helping females and always have. It's needed for survival. She expects him to make sacrifices, perhaps even death. Feminism exploits that, but men have started to notice. When women notice that men are noticing, that is when feminism will go. When it affects women, it will be history. My name is Raymond Cuttill. You can find me on my website, raymondcuttill.com. That's RaymondCuttill.com. I'm doing a book of the same name, From Amoeba to Feminist, and maybe a Patreon. You can find it all on my website, raymondcuttill.com. Thank you for watching this.